I'm just going to read you a little bit from this. In Fight Like Hell, Kim Kelly throws wide the doors to inspire all of us to seize power for ourselves by showing how, yesterday and today, the oppressed and overlooked, the outcasts and the misfits shaped history. That is the one and only international president of the Association of Flight Attendants, Sarah Nelson, giving an incredible quote for Kim Kelly's new book called Fight Like Hell: The Untold History of American Labor. I am so excited. I've been waiting to have this conversation. Kim Kelly is also she's a labor reporter. You may know her from Teen Vogue. And is that a book or a poster of your book in the background, Kim?
It's a real book. They let me do a real book.
It went on sale,
Can you
what,
believe
3 days
it?
ago?
Yeah, today, yeah, the 26th, it came out. They let me get away with it.
Congratulations.
Can you believe it? I can't.
How do you feel?
It's wild. Like, I'm really happy and I really hope people like it. And I am really worn out from doing all this press tour stuff, but I'm excited to talk to you because I'm like, oh my God, finally one of my friends.
Oh, well, we love you. And hopefully everybody has been kind. Although it would be funny. I would love to see you go on a conservative show and talk about this. And yeah.
I know there's a lot of conversations around like, should we try and take advantage of these massive like platforms that people have, like these evil demons like Tucker Carlson? Like, I know
Yeah.
Christian Small's got a lot of flack for going into the show. And it's definitely an interesting decision as a way to reach a lot of people. I don't think I would do well because like Tucker Carlson's already yelled about me on this show before. Like, we don't need to
I
I don't
remember
need to
that.
hear what he thinks, right?
I think it
It's been a
depends
weird
on
few
the
years.
the situation. I mean, you can go on like a CNBC or something like that with all the business reporters and, like a
Yeah.
Neil Cavuto on Fox Business, but Tucker's got a demonic motive. I mean, it's there are some people you can sway from Fox News that are not, Trumpian white supremacists, believe it or not. It's like the only news in town. With that being said, it's something that requires a lot of practice and skill. And I'm not saying that you don't have it. You definitely do. It's
I
just,
don't
oh,
have the
come on.
media training for that.
Not everybody should, by the way. I always say something like, not everybody should be that person. There are folks who need to do deep work, and you've done incredible research here. I don't even know where to begin because there's so much to talk about. I'm like, can we do a Joe Rogan podcast and do 3 hours of this? Not Joe Rogan, like our version. Okay.
There's a lot in
So
there, and I remember most of it at this point.
so this is okay, this is so well needed, right? I mean, the labor movement is having a revival. There's a lot of energy. When did you start writing this book?
I started it, let's see, I think really like March or April 2020 is when I sat down. I was like, oh, I gotta write this thing now. And I started trying to write it as I would, and this is true of the entire time I was writing the damn thing. I was going back and forth from Philly, where I live, to Alabama, where I was covering first an effort by Amazon workers in Bessemer to organize and to try and unionize there. And then I got sucked into this coal miner strike down the road in Brookwood. And I think I lost track of the amount of time I've been back and forth. So I was like doing all this research and sitting in my little office, like being a little gremlin, typing this book up for half the time. And the rest of the time I was going down to Alabama into this very current and alive labor conflict. It definitely an interesting experience.
And at that time, did you feel like there was something different than, a traditional strike that may not be getting attention, the way now a lot of strikes are?
Oh, and with the folks in Alabama,
Yeah.
man, they're still on strike. They're out here year two. They eclipsed Pittston. I mean, there's a lot of factors in that strike that have really drawn my interest. And of course, I've become so close with some of the people involved that it's become kind of personal. I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, they're my friends. Like, now I need to make sure that people know what my friends are up to and that they get a good contract. But I think something about that strike that has always stuck out to me is the fact that it hasn't gotten as much attention as so many other strikes because of who the workers are and because
Mm.
of assumptions about who they are and assumptions around what they believe or who they voted for or what they're actually fighting for. And it just goes to show that there's a lot of ignorance around what's happening in more rural areas, maybe in the
Mhm.
deep south or in the Midwest or in the Northeast, like, or not the Northeast, the Northwest. Like, there were so many incredibly important and interesting labor struggles happening around the country all the time, like
Mhm.
not just New York, not just LA, though they're also important. Like, it just kind of solidified this idea for me that like, oh wow, there's literally stuff happening everywhere all the time. There just aren't enough labor reporters, not enough labor friendly publications there to cover them all. So at least I can stick with this one.
But I mean, but you say New York and LA. I mean, those are media towns. So even though the Buffalo Starbucks workers were not in New York City, um, it's fascinating because it may have in a weird way boosted this existing work that you've been working on independently. Now there are more labor reporters, or more, at least
Yeah.
there's more labor interest.
It's been wild over the past, like, I guess 2 years since I sat down to do this, and I'm talking to you here today, like, it's kinda driven me a little crazy, like, as a reporter, because 'cause I'm like, "Well, I can't go and cover the Kellogg strike, the John Deere strike, like, Striketober is passing me by because I have to
Right.
finish this chapter." But it was so gratifying and so, uh, just wonderful to see how many people are covering these stories now, have gotten interest in these stories, whether it's brand new labor reporters or other reporters who have become interested in the beat. Like it seems like there's so many more of us now, and it's such a wonderful thing to see because like they're never going to be enough to tell every story that needs to be told. But we're in a hell of a better place than even when I started like 5 or 6 years ago.
That's incredible. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, I don't know where we begin. Let's say, like, what has happened since the early 60s, and how labor has evolved, whether, actual in terms of like actual organized labor, maybe as the politics of the country has changed. I think folks are very familiar with Reagan, and how the Democratic Party has disassociated itself with labor in many ways in the last 40 years. But how does that, let's juxtapose the movement, the actual labor organizing, with the politics of the time. And I'll just
Mm.
like leave it to you. We'll just kind of build, because there is a lot in this book, and I don't even know where to at this point to begin.
I mean, the 60s and 70s were such like an incredibly important and like such a vibrant and vital time for organizing, especially in spaces where there were more marginalized workers who were trying to make things happen. Like one of my favorite chapters, The Prisoners, goes into the legacy and past and present of incarcerated workers organizing. In the 70s, there was this explosion of prisoners organizing unions within prisons, and in some cases they were able to work with organized labor outside the walls, and they're kind of like gaining some ground. There are chapters of various like prisoners labor unions across the country, and the Supreme Court came in and was like, oh no, you can't be doing all that. There are a bunch of legal things that happened before that, right? But essentially in 1977, the Supreme Court ruled Jones versus North Carolina Prisoners Labor Union basically ruled that people in prison who are working don't have the right to join or organize a union. Like every other worker,
Mm.
well, not every other worker in this country, right? But like so many other workers in this country, they are denied that, even though they go to work and they have a boss and sometimes make a tiny bit of money. They can't clock out, and they're not, they lost that right. But the workers kept organizing anyway. And I guess that's just one example of how the state has gotten in the way of workers trying to organize.
Right.
And there's the book is like kind of sort of chronological, but not in like a in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s.
Right.
I kind of pick out different pieces and try to show how different struggles intersected. So I mean, if there's anything specific that jumps out to you that's interesting, or any specific like political fail that jumps out to you too, like I'm down to get into it.
I mean, this is okay. So let's. Oh God.
Put you on the spot.
I know the problem is that we don't have 2 hours. And no, it's fine,
I
because I
know,
marked
right?
it up, but I'm like, I really should have had questions. Like, I never do this because it's usually just a rolling conversation, but there really is a lot. Okay,
No,
so
it's way more fun this way because I've gone. There's a lot of folks that I've talked to have had like very specific questions about like specific dates or specific strikes, and I'm like, thank you for asking that. Let me check real quick because, like I said, there's so much stuff in here, and I wrote it
right.
like a year ago, and so much has happened. Like a lot of interviews, folks have asked me about the Amazon labor union, which has been really fun to learn more about. But like, there are a lot of reporters like Lauren Gurley and Louis Leon, Maximilian Alvarez, like
Yep.
people who have been following that really closely. So I'm always like, just go read what they had to say, and I'll give you my like nerdy, historically based take after.
Because it's in the moment. So I'll start with the beginning, because this is what my personal I think this is lost in the conversation. I'm really glad that you led with women, just how important women have been to labor, and still are, by the way, which is why I think this is
Yeah,
great.
we're
So
out here.
you've dedicated a few chapters to this, quite a few. I love it. Um, I think people know about the garment workers, in New
I
York
would
City.
hope.
Well, I should say. I think people
That's one of the
seriously
big
do.
ones, right? Like, a lot of people like, I feel like the big ones that people know about are maybe the Triangle Factory fire,
Yeah,
maybe people know Cesar Chavez, maybe they know, like, something about auto workers, but that's kind of the broad strokes that most people who aren't invested in this stuff or aren't actively studying it know. So I was like, "Well, let me pull out all these other interesting things and slap them in there, and hopefully we can get, yeah, just raise not raise awareness, but just teach people about our history because so much it hasn't been lost. Like a lot of brilliant historians and academics and researchers have preserved it and have done really incredible work, digging into that. But it's not that easily accessible. Like there aren't that many radical labor histories sitting around Barnes and Noble. Well,
right.
there's one now, but
For now.
yeah, for now. Hopefully there'll be a whole lot more because this is kind of just the beginning. I hope people pick this up and dig into the bibliography, which is like this thick, and find, new threads to pull and new books and authors to explore. Because this is like, yeah, I could only fit so much. I fit a lot, but I think we had about like 40,000 words cut because I showed up with this draft. My editor was like, uh, that's
Oh
like
my
three
god.
extra trees worth. Like we can't be doing all that.
Oh my god. It's so funny you say that about Barnes& and Noble. I was in Europe, was this last year? I can't even tell because this pandemic is, like, confusing, but I was in Europe, and I love going to bookstores in Europe because they're just so much better. They're like there's a stark you can find books on labor and much cheaper
Mm,
stuff that's really hard to find in the US because even if you go on, and I hate to say Amazon, there's a reason you can't find it on Amazon because it's not, you know,
it's just
complimentary,
not
so
a like I think of like one of my favorite bookstores, Houseman's in London. They have like a
Mhm.
whole labor section. And it's like in the
Exactly.
front. It's like right there. It's like, oh yeah, of course people should have access to this history. It should be easy to
Exactly.
find. It's like, why?
Exactly.
But I guess it's like this is my like conspiracy brain, right? Where it's like,
No, no,
well,
no, it's true.
the people in power don't want us to know about how powerful we are because
It's
then they're gonna
capitalism. No, that's
yeah.
exactly what
Oh,
it is. I was in Scotland, I came back, and I went to Barnes& and Noble for something and killing time, and what I see that was, like, the suggested picks versus what I saw in Scotland was, like, Andrew Cuomo's pandemic book, and I'm like, "Ah!" And just, like,
Lord help
how to
us.
get rich and, like, all the bullshit American I mean,
Yeah.
if you really wanna
There's a
understand us
business section or a self-help section, but there's not like a labor history section or a people's history
exactly,
section. Like business, I don't business isn't who wants to know about business? That's boring.
right.
Like
And the people who are making money off of it, they're in their own little circle, and they all went to, like, the same business schools.
yeah, they're
So
not shopping at Barnes& and Noble.
they're not traveling to Barnes& and Noble. I do wanna talk about the New Deal and labor,
Mm,
and
my girl
can you
Frances.
yes. So, I think there's a lot of folks who, the New Deal, is critically important, but there's a lot of criticisms also of the New Deal, leaving out many people of color, in many capacities, but there's an overlap with labor, I guess, without kind of I don't wanna give it all away, but, um how do you feel the New Deal and labor dealt with women, people of color, marginalized communities, given the criticism, like the big picture criticisms of the New Deal?
Mm. So, I'm not a New Deal scholar, so I'm sure you know more about than I do. But in
Probably
terms
not.
of what I cover, yeah, I mean they're doing my best out here, right? But in terms of the New Deal and the way that I kind of cover it and approach it in the book, I kind of approach it through the lens of Frances Perkins,
Right.
who was just this incredible. I actually, man, speaking of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, I'm in New York right now, and
Uh-huh.
we walked by the plaque that they have on the Brown Building, like
Yeah.
where the tragedy happened. And of course, there's
Right by
construction.
Washington
I
Square
couldn't get
Park,
close to it.
the folks.
Yeah, like people should be able to check that out. But that was just kind of nice. I was like, oh, I know you. You read my book. But Frances Perkins was this woman who I think she's probably about my age when this happened. She happened to be in New York visiting a friend when the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire happened, and she witnessed it. She could,
Oh
hear
my
the
god.
screams and smell the burning flesh. Like it had an indelible impact on her. And she was already involved in. She worked for like the Consumer Protection League, something like that, like trying to
Hmm.
help out consumers. And she was already interested in social justice and workers' issues, but that kind of changed the trajectory of her whole life, and she became involved in local politics and like different regulatory committees and agencies trying to help with workplace safety and fire safety specifically. And she did a whole bunch of stuff, but the big thing that she did, she ended up being appointed to the cabinet as the first, well, the first female cabinet member in general, and definitely the first Secretary of Labor. And she was a huge she was one of the architects of the New Deal. Like a lot of that came from her. Like she's the one who
Mhm.
came up with Social Security, and she was also just involved in all of the worker centric parts of it. Like that was her whole thing. And like one of the big and she I think she's just an incredibly fascinating person to read more about. But something that happened during that era was we got some of these labor laws. We got some things that were helpful in a way, but like you said, still left people out. Like we're still dealing with the after effects of that. Like talk about National Labor Relations Act 1935. That was a big deal that
Mhm.
has made it much easier for workers to collectively organize and bargain, but not everybody. It left out several specific categories of workers. One, independent contractors, which is just like, that's a mess. Just
And
pay
how
my
much,
taxes.
just
Ugh.
for folks, like, independent contractors then, was it as large of did we see in the same way as we do now?
I don't really know, like, I don't know as much about the history of that specific classification. I'd love to learn more about it because, like, it sucks being one, and I would love to know
Right.
how we got into this mess, right? But two of the other groups that were left out explicitly and on purpose, domestic workers and agricultural workers. And at that time, those workers were generally Black women and Black men, and they were cut out because Southern lawmakers who were racist did not want those workers to have those rights, to be able to organize, to be able to build power. So the only way that they could pass that bill was to cut out these more vulnerable workers. And we're still seeing the after effects of that now. And it's kind of like, yeah, history rhyming, right? Like the only way we can pass some very useful legislation is to leave a bunch of people out.
Right.
Wild how it seems like they still love doing that.
Shocker. You do touch on the racism, that occurred during the time. We don't have a ton of time. I again, like, there's just so much going on. There's a lot in this book. It's really phenomenal. Okay, so the Pullman Railway porters. I can't say it's a. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, A. Philip Randolph helped form the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was like I think it's the first black led, predominantly black labor union that was like recognized as part of. I'm not sure when they incorporated with the AFL, but yeah, they're a big deal. We'll just say that they're a big deal. You
Mhm.
can read more about it in the book, but they were representing Pullman porters who worked on the Pullman company's fancy sleeper cars, and all of those workers were Black men, and that was intentional because that's the I'll get into it more in the book. I don't want to give too much away. Shout out to Joseph Pullman. What a dick. There was basically, yeah, it was like the most yeah, these workers really needed a voice in the job. They really needed some help dealing with like the low wages and the outright racism and just all of the garbage that came with working in that environment, serving predominantly white moneyed passengers. And that union was like that was a huge deal that made a big impact on labor movement. And a lot of people involved in that union went on to be involved in other struggles, whether it's in labor and the civil rights movement. And one part of that struggle that stood out to me that I wanted to dig into was the fact that there are also Black women that worked on the Pullman cars, the Pullman maids. And the union, which is run by men, didn't really have their back. It kind of cut them out. It didn't really advocate for them or include them the way that it stood up for the men. And it just kind of goes to show that even within these incredibly necessary and progressive labor organizations that have such sweeping and crucial goals, like some people still got left out. And I wanted to, there are a bunch of great books about it. Melinda Chatavert has a great book just specifically about them. But yeah, it just kind of shows a lot of the one of the big lessons I learned in my book, and hopefully readers will learn. Like there's always someone who got left out and
Mhm.
they had to figure things out on their own, but a lot of times they did it, you
Yeah.
know?
But the Pullman, but this labor effort in the beginning, it really was critical for a rising Black middle class, as you stated.
Yeah, that was like because obviously at that time, like there weren't a lot of options for Black men to get good jobs. Like they're
Mhm.
stuck doing the dirtiest, lowest paying, most dangerous work. And to work as a Pullman porter, it was still really hard work. There was a lot of discrimination and racism and like the mental strain and anguish of that. But it still at that time was seen as kind of the like the best gig going. Like if you're a
Right.
Pullman porter, like you could pass that position down to your son. Like you could build something for your family in a way that hadn't been accessible before. And the union was a big part of making that such a strong option for folks.
Okay, before we wrap, I want to talk about because I know our audience is going to be interested in this red baiting. Everyone
Mm.
loves to talk about red baiting. So, when did, I mean, we McCarthyism was obviously a big factor in this, but how did that influence organizing internally?
Oh man, there's so many instances like in the book and just throughout labor history of like these just like incredibly effective and beloved and radical organizers and rank and file worker leaders who just because like they were socialists or anarchists or communists, they're part of the wrong party, had the wrong card in their wallet. They were blacklisted, they were intimidated, they were abused, they're run out of the movement entirely. And it's just like it's just so it's not funny, it's just so absurd because like so many of the most important organizers in labor history in the US have been socialists and anarchists and communists. Like, of course, it's the radicals who are willing to put everything on the line and to push for a better future. Like, you kind of have to have a little bit of that big sky thinking if you're going to try and go from like point A to point Z, like the way that so many of these workers have had to. I mean, I think about, I wrote about her more for The Nation. I couldn't squeeze her in as much as I wanted to, but just a organizer named Emma Tenayuka, who was really involved in a pecan sheller strike in Texas. And I think it was the 30s, and she was just an incredibly effective organizer who was blacklisted and like moved out of town because her family was being threatened because she was a communist, and like it's just such an absurd thing that so few people who don't already have an interest or a stake in learning more about it, like so few people know how important like radicals have been to the history of this country, even like and like the best stuff, like all the stuff the Democrats like to take credit for, like
Yeah.
thank the commie for that, honestly.
That's like, like hashtag. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting though, because like they were even driven out of unions. I mean, this is
Yeah.
I think in especially in context of where we are today and in understanding how labor can be disrupted and people can be smeared. I mean, we've seen these efforts with Christian Smalls. Obviously, it was a very big story. How
Mm.
you know the emails that were sent out about him, but also just elected officials. Like on the electoral side, it is a great way to divide and conquer and ostracize folks. They're still using the same tactics, but I think the conditions are just ripe for more organizing. And you've really laid out a great toolkit, I guess, is you know, read your history, understand your history, essential reading. Oh my god, I want to talk about this more. I hope to have you. Well, you're on all the time, but maybe next time we can. I'll just like find one chapter because there's so much I
Yeah.
can't.
There's lots, and
Guys,
there's like so much I couldn't fit in there because like thankfully there's so many brilliant historians who have done so much deeper digging into this that like I wanted to squeeze in everything. And there's so much I don't know still that I'm still continuing to research and continue to learn about this stuff. So you can imagine like it just never ends, right? Like the people's history, there's never a stopping point because we're living through it right now.
exactly. Well, that means you're going to have many books. So
Well, people buy this one, you'll see.
go buy it. Wait, I have the mirrored thing here right now, so I can't even fight like hell. There you go. Don't buy it on Amazon or Barnes and Noble. Go buy it from your
Bookshop.
local indie. What bookshelf is that? What you want? People
Bookshop.org.
bookshop.
It's a way
Oh,
that
there
you
it is.
can
Yeah.
support independent booksellers and indie bound, like, beg, borrow, steal, order it from your library. I love the library thing. Some people have done that too.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
you also have to make money. So,
I just want people to read it.
oh,
That's what I
spoken
wrote
like a
it.
true progressive. I just want people to read it. I don't want to
Yeah,
make
I
a
wrote
money.
it for people to read on their break or on the bus. Like, this is our
That's
history and
good.
we deserve to know about it.
Go check it out. Essential reading, summertime reading if you have a vacation. Good stuff. And it also, the other thing is, it's like it's super informative, but it reads well. Like you're a great storyteller. I
Thank
should have
you.
led with that.
Appreciate that. I tried to make it fun because no one's going to want to sit here and read a 300-page history book if there isn't a little, pizzazz in there.
Well, you're all pizzazz. Kim Kelly, thank you as always for joining us. Go check out Fight Like Hell. Indie booksellers, that's where you got to find them. If you are lucky enough to have an independent bookstore that's could sell it, you can also order it from there because we have one in our neighborhood. And when they don't have books, I say, "Can you order this?" And they love when I do that. It's
Yeah.
so you can also do that too. Make sure
Yeah.
to demand that they bring it forward and not like 9,000 copies of an RBG like picture book. That's
And
every indie bookseller in New York is like there's like an RBG picture book in it.
and support union booksellers, you know? There's a lot of those out there now.
Exactly.
Booksellers are workers too. We're all in it together.
Indeed. Kim Kelly, thank you so much for joining us. We live in crazy times where the tech giants seem to want to own every single part of our lives, literally our data. They want to own how we're able to make money. Do you remember the days when you could post something on YouTube and then it would like fall, it would lead you to another amazing YouTube show? And then I remember I was thinking about this the other day. I was on YouTube and I found all these like amazing actors putting together their own shows and they were so funny. Yeah, that doesn't exist anymore. That is not what YouTube is anymore. We're not in the era where you can just explode and make millions of dollars on YouTube overnight unless you're really boosted. Nope, we are in the era where it's got to be word of mouth and community driven. Patreon has really kept us going and we are so incredibly grateful to our existing patrons. Go to patreon.com/The Nomiki Show, starting off at $5, all different levels. We've got swag, we've got mugs, we've got bags.